Hello Constitutional Law class, this is Professor Opterbeck, and this is the summary video for week 3 and the introduction to week 4. So with our abbreviated week last week, with me being away at the cybersecurity conference, we continued our discussion of federalism and the Commerce Clause. And as we saw, we discussed whether in fact there's a new federalism under the Rehnquist Court. And we saw that really from the second wave of New Deal cases up through about 1995, there hadn't been a federal statute invalidated under the Commerce Clause. But now suddenly, with the Rehnquist Court and the Gun-Free School Zones Act, we see a statute being invalidated as an improper extension of federal power under the Commerce Clause. And so we kind of really looked at, we really didn't tease out of this a new test, and it wasn't entirely clear as we looked through these cases which test exactly was being applied. Rehnquist said he was applying a substantially effect test, and his suggestion was that this particular case involving schools, the carrying of guns near school zones, was really a kind of paradigmatic local activity, not something that, according to him, substantially affects interstate commerce. And we looked at the different opinions in that case and how the different justices would play that issue out. We then looked at the Violence Against Women Act case, the Morrison case, and again a Rehnquist case, saying, yes, here there are some congressional findings that seem to support a nexus to interstate commerce, but those findings alone aren't enough. The court is still going to look at it independently. And again, here the court says that this really is not a matter of national lawmaking, but should be a matter of local lawmaking. And then once again, we saw different opinions of the different justices and how they would turn that case out. So we asked, is there in fact a new federalism? But then we saw sort of a blip in this apparent trend with the California marijuana case, where Justice Stevens says, well, no, this is very much like Wickard. It's growing local product. He seems to apply a rational basis test, not the substantially affects test, distinguishes Lopez and Morrison, trying to sort of confine them factually. And again, we see some of the concurrences and other opinions in that case and the way the different justices would approach it. And then, to make things even clearer than mud, we got to the Commerce Clause part of the Obamacare case. And as we saw there, kind of the idea, and we talked a bit about externalities and the question of whether the Interstate Commerce Clause allows Congress, in a sense, to regulate very broadly externalities. And we saw how Justice Roberts dealt with this first under the Necessary and Proper Clause, making fine distinctions, not applying the Comstock test, and how the other justices would deal with that. And then Justice Roberts saying this also doesn't stand up under the Commerce Clause. This would really be too broad. The individual mandate is something that would require people, he says, to buy a product, and the Commerce Clause can't extend that far. Now, as we'll see next week, we get into the taxing and spending power parts of the case, and the results come out somewhat different, as we know that at least a substantial part of the act ultimately gets upheld by Justice Roberts under the taxing power. And again, we see how the different justices in the different dissents and concurrences would play out this case. It's, as we discussed, just not clear what kind of test was applied, or even if there was a test applied in the Obamacare case under the Commerce Clause, or whether it really just shows that very often these determinations are policy decisions that then particular kinds of tests or frameworks get attached to after the fact. So that's really what we covered last week in the Commerce Clause. As we move into this next week, we are going to talk about the 10th Amendment as an external restraint and the taxing power. So we're going to finish up these pieces that we didn't quite get to last week, and we will see again how Justice Roberts deals with this really interesting question of whether the Obamacare mandate with the related tax/penalty in fact is a penalty or a tax, and whether it's authorized. And then we'll also see how all of this gets dealt with under the spending power, and groups of cases again beginning with New Deal cases about the scope of the spending power. And then for the rest of the week, for Thursday and Friday, we're going to move into the Dormant Commerce Clause. And as we discussed, the Dormant Commerce Clause is the idea that the Commerce Clause gives the federal government a exclusive ability to regulate interstate commerce, and that even where Congress hasn't regulated, there may be areas in which state law is overstepping its bounds and getting into areas of interstate commerce that are really reserved to the federal government. We'll talk about the scope of that. We'll talk about where the state itself is a participant in the market. That's the market participant exception. And we'll talk about laws that appear to be facially neutral as to interstate commerce and how the court decides whether, in fact, they're not really neutral in effect and whether they may violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. So we will get into all of that this week. I look forward to a good week, and I will see you all in class tomorrow.